Hi, I'm Nick Beauchamp. I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University and also faculty member at the Network Science Institute. And today I'll be talking to you about a set of interlinked projects that I put under the general umbrella of conceptual networks. I'd like to thank the program chairs and program committee for inviting me. I've very much been looking forward to this talk, and I'm very much looking forward to questions and comments after the talk. I'd also like to thank my two co-authors for some of this work, Sarah Sugars and Peter Levine. I've been working with both of them for a number of years, particularly on the first project that I'm going to be showing you here. Sarah is at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern and will soon be at NYU, and Peter's at Tufts University. Both of them have been invaluable for working through a lot of these ideas, and Sarah and I have produced a number of projects related to this general idea of conceptual networks. So what do I mean by conceptual networks? Well, it's fairly intuitive. And in fact, if you talk to people about sort of what they think the relations are between ideas in their head, they'll often say things like, you know, they're connected to each other in various ways. If I think about something else, that implies something else. Or if I think about, you know, my mother, that reminds me of, you know, something else, Freudian, I guess. A lot of different theories, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes, are implicitly or explicitly premised on the idea that there are these connections between ideas or between beliefs or between norms in our minds, and that these connections kind of affect how we think about things and the beliefs and actions that we take. The other idea that's sort of common in a lot of these frameworks is that not only are the ideas connected up in our heads in various ways, but we all sort of partake of a generally shared sort of cultural set of ideas or beliefs, or we in fact partake of many different cultural sets of beliefs and ideas that are interlinked in a sort of larger cultural milieu that we sort of are fascists of. And the third idea that's often sort of prevalent when you sort of talk to people about these things is that how we speak and how we talk to each other, how we debate, how we discuss things, in some ways can be thought of as a walk through this semantic network, where I think of one idea and then I free associate to another, then I free associate to another, or you say something and then I say something that's supporting it or maybe contradicting it, depending on whether we're sort of arguing with each other or agreeing with each other. So there are these sort of three different components to thinking about how concepts are networked up in our heads that it turns out a lot of different people and a lot of different disciplines kind of share. So this is just sort of a brief review here of all those different disciplines out there that really sort of talk about and think about ideas or beliefs or knowledge or words as connected up in these sorts of networks. Starting from the 50s with sort of the rational work of Tolman or Cohen, where you have, you know, implications and logical connections, to the cognitive maps of Axelrod way back in 1976, or Carley. On the right there is a picture of one of Axelrod's conceptual networks, where, you know, in Axelrod's mind, there were sort of policies and actions that one would take, and some of them supported each other and some of them contradicted each other. We also have sort of different strands discussing conceptual networks as sort of knowledge structures between beliefs, epistemic networks, which have potentially combinations of skills and knowledge and values, which can, you know, potentially even be inferred from essays as well as from people. And then sort of more recently, perhaps more closely to what we're going to be looking at here, we have semantic networks where either subjectively or computationally, one tries to infer from large corpora of text how words are connected to each other in sort of a network of semantic interrelationships. So a lot of these different disciplines were really fairly discrete from each other and not talking to each other for a long time. And in many ways, they continue to today. And as we've been sort of working on this project, we keep discovering like a new subfield that had the idea of networks of beliefs or ideas lurking in it explicitly or implicitly. And the general trajectory has been sort of beginning with kind of just this theoretical realization that there's this underlying structure, much of which was not particularly empirical at all, and then moving to a slightly more empirical stage where either people would try to, you know, produce these networks on their own, or they try to elicit it from individuals, but it was fairly subjective in how they would do it. And then sort of moving beyond that to doing things in a little more systematic way. Maybe the semantic networks can be examples of that, where they tried to be sort of a little bit more objective or systemic or large scale in inferring these things. But often what they were inferring would be sort of collective networks, that is, how words are connected to each other in, the general populace or in the English language or something like that, rather than how they're connected in any individual's, particular individual's head. So the plan today is kind of reflecting the sort of tripartite layout that I was discussing a couple of slides ago. The first project that I'm going to be talking about is really sort of confronting the fundamental question here, which is like, do these things really exist? Or at least, do they exist in the same way, say, personality traits exist or beliefs exist? Are there systemic ways of identifying them? Are they consistent across time, between individuals, within cultures, that sort of thing? So the first project is going to be really about trying to detect and validate these sorts of networks, how to measure them, and what sort of structural patterns can we see in them. And because I'm a political scientist, I'm always interested in the political aspect of this. And it turns out that in this first project, what we found out is that there really is a sort of strong political theme or political aspect to a lot of these network structures, which we didn't entirely expect, actually. So I'm going to spend a little bit less time on the second two projects, but the second one is looking at, are there better ways to sort of try to infer these networks? The first project, I'll be discussing a number of different approaches that we took to trying to infer network structures from individuals. And the second project, I'll be sort of developing a more customized Bayesian model for sort of inferring these networks, particularly from the type of data that we have a lot of, which is not interview data or, as we'll see, sort of interactive graphical data, but rather textual data. I do a lot of work with textual data, and so one of the things I'm really interested in here is, can we infer these sorts of networks from raw textual production of the sort that we find abundantly on the internet these days, or even just sort of political speeches by politicians. And the third project I'm going to be talking about very briefly at the end is, how do we think that these networks affect speech behavior? How do they affect how people interact with each other? If the second project is sort of looking at kind of text documents produced by a single individual while they're speaking or while they're writing or that sort of thing, the third project is looking at sort of exchanges between individuals, where again, the idea is that we would expect that if you say something about some topic, I'm going to say something kind of related to it, but maybe contradicting it or supporting it or something like that. So the plan here is, let's first spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out whether these things are really real, and if so, what can we say about them? The second is sort of looking at how do we build more robust and sophisticated models for inferring these things, and the third is how could we use them to predict and better understand how people discuss things. And again, because I'm a political scientist, all of these things are going to be sort of through the lens of politics, and the third one is going to be looking at how people argue about politics. All right, so the first project. This is fundamentally a measurement and validation project. The idea was, if we believe that these things exist, how do we elicit them from people, and how stable are they across different types of elicitation? And if they are unstable in various ways, are there any underlying structures we can detect that sort of allow us to gauge systematic relationships across individuals or within individuals? So the approach here was a set of fairly intensive surveys with a fairly small number of individuals. We got a bunch of Turkers, about 100 of them. We gave them a very thorough 30-minute interactive survey. What we wanted to do is try to elicit these networks in as many different ways as we could think of. Like, let's try to figure out what are the different ways that we can try to get these things out of people's heads, and let's try to then figure out whether these networks are robust in some ways across the different elicitation methods. So the first approach that we took was sort of an interactive drawing program, where we'd actually have people sort of like write out little words and phrases and then connect them with lines. The second one was sort of a chat bot, where the chat bot would ask basically act like a kind of annoying 5-year-old and say, why do you believe this? Oh, well, why do you believe that? Oh, well, why do you believe that? You know, on and on, to sort of elicit a bunch of beliefs and ideas from people. And then we would, after they'd been elicited, after these sort of ideas would be elicited, we'd ask them to sort of connect them up just using a graphical interface. And the third approach, which is actually kind of two different approaches, is asking people to write a very brief essay on whatever the topic was, and then to use natural language processing methods to try to extract the network from those chunks of text that we got from people. So in this particular experiment, what we wanted to do was ask people sort of interesting, salient political questions that would sort of get them engaged, and that we believe that people have a fairly robust set of ideas about already in their minds. So we asked them a question about their beliefs about abortion, a question about their beliefs about child rearing, which is actually a fairly good way of measuring authoritarian tendencies in individuals, and is strongly correlated with political beliefs. And we asked them their opinion about sort of the availability of healthcare. So it was kind of a social issue question, a sort of control and political authoritarian question, and a question about policy. And so the basic idea was, for each of these questions, we'd have them do all three of the network methods, and then we would sort of compare these different network methods within individuals and across individuals. The other thing we did was we collected a bunch of demographic information about the individuals, including a bank of personality questions, including the moral foundations by Haidt and the Big Five by John and many other people, and also a set of politics questions, including knowledge and ideology. So we really wanted to get a bunch of different sort of measures that were already sort of established psychological baselines, so that we could sort of say, you know, does anything in these networks correlate with these things that we already know exist? So just to sort of briefly discuss how we were kind of measuring these networks. The first, as I said, was the interactive network drawing. Again, we would say, you know, something like, do you think it's the responsibility of the federal government to provide healthcare coverage to everybody? And then we'd say, okay, now in this box, put down all the ideas in sort of brief phrases that you think are sort of associated with this, this question, and then go down here in this graphical interface and sort of connect them up together however you want, and add sort of a nice little interactive thing. So it was very much like the most literal way we could think of like trying to elicit networks from individuals. The second approach, which is kind of mirroring some of the approaches that previous work in the literature had done in a subjective way, where individuals would interview other individuals to try to elicit these networks. We kind of tried to automate that by sort of having a little chatbot that would ask these questions. And you know, it was a very simplistic chatbot. There was nothing, there's no neural network or anything else under that. It was basically just why? Do you think that they should have health care? Can you explain why? Can you say what your keywords are? And then we'd do that for a few layers, and then at the end we would ask them to sort of connect up these things. We wouldn't even show them the network at the end. We would just sort of take that for our use later on. And the third approach was to ask them to write an essay. And actually what we'll see here is that we had two different NLP approaches. One is at the word level, where we just take all the nouns and we connect them up if they co-occur within a sentence or within 10 words within the same sentence. And the second approach is trying to figure out sort of a slightly higher level semantic unit, where we try to cluster those words according to sort of interconnected meanings, using LDA, latent delay allocation, to turn them into word clusters. And then basically we would connect those word clusters. So instead of having nouns as the nodes, we would have clusters of nouns as the nodes. I'll talk a little bit about that more here, and also talk about that considerably more in the second project, which uses topic modeling to try to do this in a slightly more sophisticated way than just sort of throwing it into a topic model and then connecting things up that co-occur with each other. So one thing just to say is that, you know, people are fairly skeptical of Mechanical Turk. It turns out in this particular case that the essays that our subjects wrote were, you know, quite substantial. We were obviously paying them, and we set a minimum threshold for how much text they had to produce, and most of them, you know, went 5 or 10% over the minimum. So they were definitely cognizant of trying to get this done. But at the same time, these essays are, I think at least as good as one would get from a standard undergraduate survey. There's many things to say about, how biased mechanical Turkers may be. As I said, we collected their demographics. It turns out that they're fairly reflective of this particular set that we got. Were fairly reflective of the US in general, with a slight bias towards more liberals and less conservatives. So when we're going to talk about liberals and conservatives, what we really mean is sort of relative liberals and relative conservatives, which, maybe on a 10-point scale would be, we go all the way to the 1s at the most liberal, but we probably don't get past like the 8s on the conservative side. But other than that, across a number of other demographic measures, it was fairly representative. Our goal wasn't really to be representative here. We're not trying to make statements about the US or humans in general. What we're really kind of interested in is within any set of individuals, can we find these structures? Are they consistent within individuals? Are they related to other features of those individuals? So let me just show you a few quick examples of the sorts of networks that we generate from this. The first slide here is on networks that were generated from the interactive program. These aren't exactly the networks that the individuals saw, but they're fairly close to what they saw. That is, these were the phrases they wrote out. These are the connections that they made between them. You can see that the pro-choice ones have a bunch of sort of terms like right to choose that are sort of relevant to pro-choice. The pro-life one have a bunch of terms that are relevant to pro-life. We know that the one that says pro-choice, the person who produced it is pro-choice because we asked them a survey question about their beliefs, and the pro-life one is someone who said self-identified as pro-life. So these are, two networks produced by two individuals that are connecting them. But as you can already see, like there's a huge difference between these two. One is much more densely connected. One has much larger phrases in the terms. The other is sort of more lightly connected in the shorter phrases. As we'll see, there's a lot of systematic patterns between sort of ideology and other characteristics and the types of networks that one produces. Here's an example of some networks generated by the chatbot. They tend to be a little bit sparser than the first one. That's not my toast done. That means I'm 15 minutes through. Here's one that's a set of networks generated by the essay approach. These are just sort of taking the nouns out of their essays and connecting them up. As you can see, both of these produce very dense networks, probably in some sense too dense, and a lot of these words are not like what we would consider to be truly concepts in any way. They're more like, semantic chunks. And some of them, probably should be flushed from the system, like what or set. So it's, an attempt to get sort of the most granular measure. But, what we really want is something that's a little bit more clustered and high level, where we have sort of bunches of words like legal circumstances, abortion, or rape, child, mother, that are sort of all words kind of around the same idea, so that we're getting something closer to sets of ideas that are connected. Again, this is using our topic approach. The topics work reasonably well. Some of the topics are good, some of the topics are less good. As we'll discuss in a few minutes, there are sort of better ways to do this that I work on in a later paper. But the basic idea here is that we want something as close to ideas, ideally something that the subjects themselves provide, but if we're working with text, we want something that's sort of close to the types of sort of clusters of ideas that an individual would provide if you actually ask them, what are your ideas, your beliefs, the associations that you have in your mind when asked these questions about abortion. And obviously we did the same thing with our healthcare question and our child rearing questions. All right, so as you can sort of see in these networks here, particularly if you look at the noun one, like, how do you compare the networks between, the network on the left and the network on the right? They use totally different terms, they're connected differently. The topic one, at least the nodes are consistent, but the one with the chatbot or the one with the interactive, the nodes are just random phrases that these people were producing, and there's obviously not going to be much overlap between the two. So if you wanted to ask, how are liberals networks more similar to each other than they are to conservative networks? It'd be very hard to figure out how to do that just by matching nodes, because all these nodes are different. Yet we still believe that there's something systematic underlying these things. There are thoughts about sort of the rights of the woman in this case, or the rights of the baby in this case, that are sort of consistent ideas that if the people were maybe to talk about it with each other, they would realize that, you know, they sort of have the same understanding of what that idea is. They might have different beliefs about whether that idea is, you know, normatively good or normatively bad, or how that idea is connected to other ideas. But the idea itself might be sort of a consistent object across individuals. So the question that we had is, you know, how do we compare these networks with different nodes? And the approach that we take with this is sort of, what kind of deeper structures can we find in these networks that would allow us to compare networks in a way that's agnostic to the identities of the nodes themselves? If you look at these three networks across the top of the image here, you can see that they have very different shapes, very different structures. It's a little bit hard to like articulate what's different about them. The first is more regular, the second is in two pieces, the third has like a central node and other things radiating from it. And so the idea would be, you know, if we think that individuals have these networks in their head, maybe we can't compare the networks node by node across individuals or by ideology or something. But what we can do is we can say, well, if networks have structures to them, can we talk about the types of, you know, sort of abstract structures that are in people's heads? That is, like, you know, do liberals have more sort of densely interconnected mesh-like networks? Do conservatives have like more hierarchical networks with like a central idea and a bunch of ideas that are kind of dependent on that? That would be an approach that would say, okay, we'll just throw out the information about the meaning of the individual nodes, and then we can instead talk about sort of the structures of those networks. And that would allow us to sort of say, well, okay, we've got these different statistics that we can elicit or extract from the networks that people generate. Are those statistics consistent within individual across different elicitation methods? Are those statistics consistent within like liberals or conservatives? Are those statistics consistent over time? Are they associated with beliefs? So the approach we took is, you know, we thought about these networks and like, what are sort of the core structural features that we're kind of interested in here. And the structural features that we were sort of most interested, that were kind of connected to what people seem to think might distinguish different types of ways of organizing beliefs or ideas in your head. One was connectivity, that is like how densely connected are the ideas in your head? Are they sort of a bunch of disconnected things, or are they all kind of connected to each other in a web of association? Second is like how hierarchical are they? You know, is there one node and then a bunch of other that are connected to it? That's sort of the example on the right here with the central node and then the ones radiating from it. And then the third was how complex, that is, you know, how clustered are these networks? You know, are they fractal-like with lots of little bunches and then little bunches connected to bigger bunches and so forth? Or is it all just sort of a homogeneous lattice or homogeneous random graph? And so these were sort of the three approaches that we sort of wanted to take in measuring the structural features of the networks in order to sort of say, is there consistency with the individual? That would be sort of a validation approach. Or to say, like, are there associations between these network structures and other traits of individuals like personality? The first would be sort of an internal validation, like, are these objects just consistent, independent of the elicitation method? And the second would be like an external validation approach. Are these structures related to anything that we already believe exists in the world? So the first approach, the sort of internal validity approach, is just saying, like, if we look at the statistics that we get from these networks, so we have a bunch of individuals and we've measured their networks on abortion via the essay noun approach, and then we've also measured them via the interactive approach. And then we take the, you know, the connectivity measure for all of the individuals, for all these networks. Are these statistics sort of consistent across different elicitation methods? So this particular first graph is just sort of showing you that, yes, irrespective of which approach we take, we tend to get similar density measures. That is, the same person, or similar statistics of various sorts. That is, the same person who has a higher standard deviation of degree, a higher clustering, a higher density statistic in one method tends to have a higher density or clustering statistic in another method. And now different methods correlate better or worse with each other. The sort of interactive approaches correlate strongly with each other. The essay approaches correlate strongly with each other. The interactive versus the essay ones correlate less strongly. But the main idea is like, yeah, irrespective of how you elicit these things, there does seem to be characteristic structures that we get out of people's minds when we elicit these, when we measure these networks that suggest that these things, these networks, even if their nodes are changing, even their labels are changing, are consistent within the individual, irrespective of how we measure them. So that's a sense that, you know, they do exist, that they're separate from the measurement technique. They aren't just like we ask people to produce networks and of course they produce networks, but rather that however we try to get them out, there are these sort of underlying structures, not necessarily the same network, not necessarily the same nodes, but that, you know, these structural features of hierarchy and so forth tend to be consistent within an individual, regardless of how we try to get that network out of their head. The second approach, and this is sort of the main result of this paper, is that when we went to look at like the external validity, that is, how are these structures related to other things that we know of in the world, basically what we're doing is like, you know, doing correlations between the vector of these statistics and, you know, the vector for across all of individuals of like their score on our moral foundations or a big five bank of questions that we're asking people. So here, this started as an external validity thing, but it actually became something much more interesting, where we found that basically, you know, there's a strong correlation where basically across all of our different statistics, there were just higher scores across all of our statistics, hierarchy, connectivity, complexity, clustering, for liberals, and lower scores for conservatives. So as you can see at the top, you have sort of the red is lower, so you have people who score highly on purity and authority, and conservatives just tend to have lower statistics on these things. And this is like not a normative judgment. It's just saying that like liberals and conservatives turn out to have very different sort of structures of their networks, irrespective of how we measure them, and across a number of different measures of ideology and a number of different measures of structure. So this was like the most interesting result we got, is like, wow, you know, it's not just that they, you know, talk differently or whatever, but they seem to sort of structure their ideas differently, where in this case, the liberals have more clustering and more hierarchy, and the conservatives tend to have more homogeneity and less clustering. When we looked at sort of traditional demographics, we also found that things that are associated, correlated with political ideology, like age, republicanism, being more religious or being white, versus higher income or higher education, which these days are correlated with being more liberal, tended to show the same patterns. That again, people with higher income and education tended to have sort of more hierarchy and more structure. People who are older, more Republican, more religious, or more white tended to have more homogeneity and less structure. So these results are, I think, are, you know, really pretty interesting, and they suggest quite a lot of things that I don't have time to go into here. But from a measurement point of view, it certainly shows that these structures that we're inferring have strong connections to personality and to ideology and to beliefs, and that, you know, whichever method we go with, you know, we're finding things that seem to be consistent within individuals and consistently associated with sort of characteristics of individuals. These things are real in the sense that, you know, anything psychological is real. And so for that, then I want to go on and talk very briefly about a couple of related projects. The second one was about how to measure these networks in a better way using text. And the approach is a Bayesian model that tries to say, okay, so in people's minds, there are these networks. When they are speaking, they're basically sort of on a walk through this network. What I do is I develop a topic model here that infers clusters of words and the network of the clusters of words. And the generative process that you imagine for generating documents is that for each sentence, you choose a topic, then you generate these words, and then your next sentence is a topic that's closely connected to that topic via the network that you're inferring. And so you're walking through this thing, topic by topic, generating words that are observed, and then you go back and infer these things from the observed data. So the nice thing about this Bayesian approach is that you can infer not just topics and edges, but like the uncertainty of these edges. This is using Trump's State of the Union speech, We can see that we have a bunch of topics. Another nice thing about this approach is that it omits a lot of topics when it doesn't need them. So I said you can choose up to 10 topics, and it said, I only really need 6 here. You can see sort of characteristic topics that Trump talks about. The other approach that I sort of want to talk about briefly is that you can do a hierarchical model here, which has a network of topics that everybody shares, and then each individual can have their own network. So again, this idea that we partake of the culture, but are distinctly individual in our own networks. There's a number of other extensions which I don't have time to talk about here. So this would be taking all the inaugural addresses. This is kind of the shared network that all of the speakers have. This is the network that Trump has, which has more emphasis on God and fellow and laws and freedom and that sort of thing. This would be Obama's network, which has more influence or more emphasis on dreaming and the future and so forth. Not only are these nodes stronger, but they're more densely interconnected. The last part of this project that was kind of interesting is that so far I've been treating sentences as documents. In this case, I also wanted to sort of think about words as documents. So individual will walk through these words. And what I found when I ran it through this model is that we got all these weird sort of small words when I left them in. And in fact, what I was doing is inferring parts of speech as the topics. And then when you looked at the network, it was basically like, something a little bit better than your standard Markov model. Is like a model of Trump's syntactic network. And if you read through this, if you take a walk through this, you could say, you could generate Trump-like sentences like, last year we have been the country of America, period. So that's like a Trump sentence. Here's an example from Obama. We are the generation of hope. So in any case, I don't have time to talk about that too much either, but it's the Bayesian approach, I think, is a very powerful approach for sort of inferring these networks in a way that's much more robust and allows you to do direct comparisons between individuals in these networks. The final one, which I don't really have time to talk about here, was modeling political arguments. So the idea was to take a bunch of liberal blogs and a bunch of conservative blogs, look at how people argue, where the idea would be if you say topic 5 and topic 9 is connected to it, then your interlocutor is more likely to say topic 9. The main result here was that this network approach was actually very good at predicting what interlocutors would say on the left forum, but not very good at predicting what interlocutors would say on the right-wing forum, where on the right-wing forum, the best predictor of what somebody would say in response to somebody else was just the same thing that they always said. So it's, again, suggests that like the networky approach may work better for liberals than it does for conservatives in some way or other. All right, so to conclude, the main thing that I was sort of emphasizing here is this sort of empirical validation approach, where we show that these cognitive networks are indeed real. Individuals have these typical structures that are consistent within individual across different topics and across different measurement methods. These structures reflect and are deeply related to personality, and in particular to ideology, where liberals have more hierarchy and dense networks, and conservatives more homogeneous and sparse networks. Networks also can be inferred from individual solo talk and can be used to predict how they talk, and again are strongly correlated with politics, and allow us in the second project to sort of compare individuals by inferring these sort of collective networks as well as the individual networks. And they also allow us to sort of predict and model how people respond to each other when they're arguing with each other. So that's the 3 projects that I wanted to talk to you about today. That's all about sort of conceptual networks, inferring them and then using them. I very much look forward to any of your questions and comments, again, during the brief time we have here or any time thereafter. Thank you very much.